It's about us. Well, it's about you, but I'm the one talking. Humans, no matter their skin color, generally like to assign one to aliens. And that one often tends to be green. Which might seem absurd when you think about all the shades that animal skin, scales, feathers, and fur can take. Whereas, strangely, our plants, with a few exceptions, are all green. So, if plant life exists on other planets, what colors would it have? Because even though we currently have no proof of the existence of extraterrestrial plants, that doesn't stop us from seriously asking the question. If they do exist, are they purple, green, black, red, or blue? And to try to answer that, first we'll need to understand why, on Earth, plants are most often green and not another color. To do that, let's pause for a moment. Let's take a look at photosynthesis, a phenomenon that, to put it simply, is incredibly cool. And to put it simply, it's absolutely amazing, because it captures the energy and light by making sugars from carbon dioxide and water, while most of the time releasing oxygen. And the main driver of this transformation of sunlight into usable energy is a pigment, chlorophyll. This pigment absorbs light most strongly in the blue wavelengths, which are the most energetic, and in the red wavelengths, which are much less energetic but are emitted in large quantities by our star. And all this while reflecting the wavelengths that make up the green part of the spectrum, which end up reaching our eyes. And that's why we see plants as green. And for a long time, it was thought that it made perfect sense for plants to have a pigment that captures the most abundant and energetic rays. Once they were satisfied, having enough light to eat by absorbing the reds and blues, the plants would have stopped there. You're full, you know. Except that in reality, neglecting and reflecting green is a bit of a strange tactic for an organism that's trying to make the most of the available light energy, because it's one of the main colors our star emits. So, in terms of energy, the most abundant wavelengths of solar radiation that reach the ground are precisely in the green. And here, I need to make a side note. We agree, it's yellow. In fact, if the sun doesn't appear green to us, it's because the oxygen in the atmosphere absorbs most of the blue component, and green minus blue equals yellow. There you have it, end of the side note. Let's get back to our oddity. If the most abundant wavelengths are in the green, why hasn't any pigment that specifically absorbs in these ranges of light become dominant? When you think about it, that would have given the plants that had it greater energy efficiency. Why do they apparently waste the best available light? Why not use it? Why not absorb as much light as possible, and in that case, simply be black? In fact, as strange as it may seem, even 5 years ago, these questions weren't completely answered, and even today, it's still a bit complicated. But broadly speaking, we think that plants aren't trying to capture as much light as possible, but above all to absorb the light whose intensity doesn't fluctuate much. Imagine that you are a leaf halfway up a tree in a jungle. You really have to use your imagination. Since you're not at the top of the canopy, you're overshadowed by hundreds of other leaves. And depending on the position of the sun, the time of day, thanks to clouds or gusts of wind, you could just as easily find yourself for hours under the full glare of sunlight at its zenith, or plunged into shadow, with thousands of sudden variations possible between these two states. Thus, this green pigment, chlorophyll, became dominant because it offers a good compromise, being both able to take advantage of a wide variety of wavelengths and to protect plant cells during sudden changes in sunlight. Moreover, it has been discovered that in reality, even though at the surface of the leaves, the chloroplasts, the structures in plant cells containing chlorophyll, reflect a large part of this powerful green light, the rest penetrates into the deeper layers of the plant, where the lower energy wavelengths never reach. And in the end, through reflection and scattering inside the leaves, researchers have shown that 50 to 90% of green light ends up being used by plants. And if we see leaves as green, even though a large part of that color is actually absorbed, it's also because this is the color to which the human eye is most sensitive. In short, to sum up, plants are green as a result of mastering the art of compromise, to capture the maximum amount of energy, but also in the easiest way, without burning or damaging their cells. You're perfect, color-wise. Yes, but perfect for the light coming from the sun. Now, if the main factor influencing the color of plants is the type of electromagnetic spectrum they receive, That means the star that lights them plays a key role in their color. And since the vast majority of stars in the universe are not solar type, then hypothetical extraterrestrial plants evolving on worlds orbiting other stars. So they should also have adapted to the specific ranges of light that reach them and be dressed in colors different from the plants on our planet. Let's take a look at the variety of stars found up there, which astronomers classify by giving them little names based on the letters O, B, A, F, G, K, M, which reflect their color, temperature, size, and longevity. And let's start right away by ruling out yellow dwarfs of spectral type G like our Sun, which we've talked about at length and which emit most of their light. Useful for photosynthesis in the visible range, as well as those that, being too massive, have the annoying habit of blowing up in your face quickly. There is no life around so much light and instability because these superstars, like those in rock music, shine too brightly and die young in cataclysmic explosions, making it impossible for any form of life to appear on nearby worlds, or at best only allowing the emergence of casseroles of scorched plants. But for all the stars that live for several billion years, such as Type F stars, the largest ones around which we think life could develop, it starts to become, in terms of colors, extremely interesting. And since these stars, much heavier than solar-type stars, shine much more intensely, especially in the blues and violets, one might logically think that plants that developed on worlds orbiting them should have specific pigments to protect themselves from this downpour, thus avoiding having part of their cells burned by harmful ultraviolet rays. And what better way to adapt to this excess energy than to reflect it, not in the way you might think, reflecting a large portion of the blue light that reaches them by using bluish pigments as a kind of shield. As for plants evolving around so-called Type M stars, those extremely common, small and dim red dwarfs, well, first, you have to imagine that it's possible for life as we know it to develop there. Because despite their small size, these red dwarfs can present a big problem. For the simple reason that, at the beginning of their lives, these stars can, due to their violent solar eruptions, subject their associated planets to incessant bombardments of ultraviolet rays. But let's set aside this deadly detail, assuming that aquatic life forms are able to adapt to these brief hellish conditions, until their stars, as they age, become stable enough for plants to take root on solid ground. Well, in that case, since the emission peaks of these stars are in the near-infrared range, in low-energy, long-wavelength light, it's very likely that evolution has favored a greater variety of photosynthetic pigments there. Because on paper, the temperature ranges of these stars, which make up nearly 80% of those in our universe, allow for extremely diverse palettes. Extraterrestrial plants evolving on worlds orbiting them, whether on hypothetical continents or drifting in ocean crests, could be red, yellow, orange, or purple, or even have extremely dark grayish shades, all the way to being completely pitch black. Because in the case of the darkest of these red dwarfs, stars that are nearly 1,000 times less luminous than our Sun, the challenge would become less about protection and more about absorbing as much energy as possible, capturing everything that can be used. And this gets even more complicated because we're only dealing with a single painter, a single star. Now, in our galaxy, more than half of the stars are in multiple systems, and an exoplanet orbiting a pair of stars would therefore have several sources of energy to trigger photosynthesis. So, depending on the variety of possible combinations, the distances from the planet to the stars, and the distances between the stars themselves, we also end up with a great variety of pigments that could plausibly dominate. And even though it's hard for us to decide, let's not dismiss the idea that there might be, up there, on worlds orbiting binary stars, exotic extraterrestrial plants with veins tinged with walnut. Imaginary landscapes that are perfect opportunities to conclude by reminding that these beautiful hypothetical palettes are, of course, only valid in broad strokes, especially since there's a serious flaw in the reasoning I've presented to you. Because the nature and amount of light reaching the ground depends not only on the type of star, but also on the composition of the atmosphere itself. On our planet, for example, oxygen and ozone act as bouncers that filter the type of light and define the spectral windows through which photons can pass to reach the surface. You're in, you're out. But these molecules, oxygen and ozone, they are the ones who made them. In fact, we think that when the first photosynthetic organisms appeared, our planet was almost devoid of oxygen. And to use the sun as an energy source, it was necessary to use other pigments besides chlorophyll. And it was only after the appearance of photosynthetic bacteria producing oxygen that our atmosphere began to acquire a composition favorable to the emergence of chlorophyll, which eventually became dominant. As a result, 2 billion years after oxygen began to accumulate in the atmosphere, plants, which evolved from green algae, started to conquer the land. In other words, the activity of living organisms not only changed the atmospheric composition and therefore the wavelengths available for plants to feed on, but also indirectly influenced the types of pigments that could exist on the surface. Thus, it is very likely that extraterrestrial plants have adapted by using pigments suited to absorbing the photons that are preferentially allowed through by the layers of an atmosphere that they may well have modified through their activity. And then, we also need to remain humble, because as things stand, we are limited to speaking from our own world. We started from the assumption that plants on extraterrestrial worlds would go about obtaining energy from their star in the same way as the only plant life forms we can observe and, above all, know. That is, the ones that proliferate on our planet. Now, while on Earth organisms using chlorophyll have prevailed, perhaps it has been different elsewhere. Or maybe there are physicochemical processes in nature, different pigments that can take advantage of the energy from light. So, we could just as easily imagine that around massive stars emitting a lot of bluish light, extraterrestrial plants using processes very different from photosynthesis might have gained an evolutionary advantage. By only harvesting highly energetic photons while reflecting lower quality but softer light, green or red. In that case, these plants could display any color except blue. So, we might wonder if we can ever be absolutely certain of anything. Ultimately, why should we care about these questions? Well, first of all, simply for the sheer beauty of it, the pleasure of speculation, the intellectual exercise. Sometimes a bit of knowledge for its own sake is priceless. And also because creating models that try to understand to what extent photosynthetic organisms can adapt and evolve around other stars helps us narrow down the possibilities and tells us where to look. And thus anticipate a plausible range of colors, which could in the future allow us to decipher what is hidden behind this kind of image, which will be, more or less, the type of direct visual rendering that we can hope to obtain from an exoplanet in a few decades. And this blurry, low-resolution point can give us information about the composition of the atmosphere as well as the average color of the planet. And the spectrum of light reflected by that spot could very well hide in its shades clues to the presence, or not, of forms of life evolving here on this world. Living things that would have modified the atmospheric composition, or even transformed the surface colors on a large scale through the specialized pigments they use. That's why being able to interpret and uncover what kind of visual signature could be symptomatic of the presence of life requires a good understanding of the history of the life that flourishes before our eyes. In fact, consider that the color of our planet has not always been what we know today. It is believed that there was a time when our world was purple. Indeed, we know that the first forms of photosynthetic life used a pigment called retinol, which, by reflecting red and green light, very likely made the oceans of their time appear reddish-purple. This is called the purple Earth theory. By the way, even today on Earth, even though all plants contain chlorophyll, not all of them are necessarily green. Because this color can sometimes be masked by secondary pigments. Carotenoids, for example, give leaves their autumn color. Plants living on the ground, under a dense canopy of trees and receiving very little sunlight, generally have shades of violet and red, colors that are optimal in such shade. Other plants have dark pigments that can protect them from too much light. Yeah, I know, to sum it up, this video basically says that we absolutely don't know. To disappear, to have never existed, to fade into nothingness, and no longer have to bear the heavy burden of mankind. Farewell, nurturing Earth. I loved you so much, but I am not worthy of you. I sink into the depths of the cosmos, overwhelmed by shame and despair. You know, I was thinking every time you're on screen, it makes a plant. This silence, this contempt for my jokes. Or maybe it's you, you're hard to, I won't do it. To learn a bit more about me, it's on Insta, and for those kinds of aliens that live on our planet, it's over there. Otherwise, to dive into the great diversity of exoplanet types we found, or even into the past shades of our world, it's just a go-go gadget click away, right here.